So there's definitely a million ways to paint cactuses, but I think I've discovered a pretty unique and intuitive method that I haven't seen anyone else use, and that's what I'll cover in today's video. As usual, you can find a list of the brushes and textures I'm using here in the description below. So to get started, I'm going to paint one cactus pad first. So for that, I'm going to use the abstract round brush and a somewhat dark version of my cactus color, and I'll rough this out here. After that, I'm going to use a couple of lighter shades and darker shades all over this cactus pad, but I'm going to try to make sure the top of it is a little bit lighter than the bottom. After that, I'm going to change my brush to the water blender, and I'm going to use this to soften everything up, but I'll still try to make sure the top of this pad is lighter than the bottom. Next, I want to add a little bit of shading all along the edge to make it look a little bit more curved and 3D. So for that, I'm going to grab the selection tool set to freehand, and I'm going to make a selection that pretty roughly goes along the edge. But instead of reconnecting up here, I'm going to circle back and then reconnect it. So basically I have a U-shaped selection. Then I'll feather this out just a little bit. Then I'll go to my adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just darken it and saturate it. Next, I'm going to duplicate my cactus pad, and I'm going to use the arrow tool to kind of reposition this and scale it, and also use the warp tool as well, just to make each pad a little bit unique. And I'm going to go through and use that same process to build the whole cactus, but periodically I'm going to adjust the brightness of the pad, so some of them are a little bit lighter and some of them are a little bit darker. And when I make these arrangements, I try to keep in mind that the cactus isn't really a flat thing. Some of the pads are coming towards us, some of the pads are side on, some of them are overlapping, so I try to do that when I make my arrangements. Now, once you're happy with your arrangement, I recommend merging all the layers onto one. Then you can grab the water blender brush and use it to try to get rid of this overlapping effect. You can see there's a little bit of transparency here, so I'll use the water blender to kind of blur that out. After that, I'm going to continue using the water blender, and I'm going to focus on the shading and highlight of each cactus pad. And this is definitely not an exact science, but if I imagine the light is coming from this angle, I can use the water blender to sort of enhance and pull out some of these lighter colors and push the darker colors here towards the shadow area. Now, in some cases, I feel like the highlight area isn't bright enough and I don't have any brighter greens to kind of stretch out and blend in this area. So if that's happening to you, all you got to do is just select a lighter green, use the abstract round to just paint it right on, and then go back to the water blender and kind of push that around. And I'm going to go through the whole cactus like this, just pushing the highlights and the shadows towards whatever side of the cactus pad that kind of makes sense. And I'm just going by feeling with this. Now, if you happen to go beyond the edges with the blender and you get this fuzzy edge, you can just use the eraser to clean it up. Now, the next step is optional, but I think it looks nice when the shadows kind of get a little bit bluish and cold. So to do that, I like to use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'll roughly select all the shadow areas. Then I'll feather those out a little bit. Then I can go to my adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll shift the hue to make those just a little bit bluer. And now that the shading is done, I'm going to move on and add the details. So I'll make a new layer just above the cactus. This one's going to be simple. I'm just going to use some very, very light green dots basically all over the whole thing. For the brush, I'll use the fine liner pen. And I'm going to go all over these and add dots, but I'm going to do them in a structured way. So usually what I do is I'll do it diagonally and then finish up the cactus pad, just kind of basing it off that. And that makes the dots look a little bit more organized. Now I'm going to go through the whole cactus and do the dots for each pad individually, and I think there's kind of a nice eclectic effect if I do a different density and pattern of dots on each pad. I think a main problem with digital watercolor is sometimes the results can look a little bit too perfect. So if you want to try to rough these up, I recommend going to the adjustments, liquify, set it to crystals. You can control the size of it with this adjustment. set the pressure to max, and set the distortion pretty low, around 20 or 30%. Then you can just kind of draw this on, and if you look closely here, it sort of scrambles the dots a little bit and makes them look a little bit rougher, and I think this has a nice organic effect. Another thing I like to do is soften some of these dots, so for that I'll use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'll make a pretty random selection. I'll reconnect it, I'll feather this out just a little bit, then I can go to my adjustments, Gaussian blur, and this will just blur those areas that I selected. So if I blur it a little bit, you can see in some areas the dots kind of fade away, and I think this also makes them look more natural. And there we go, this simple cactus is all done. Now when you give this a try and start painting your own cactuses, you're probably going to do some different experiments with textures and patterns, and that'll definitely result in a few cactuses that you don't like very much. So when that happens to me, I usually save those cactuses, and then later on I can kind of arrange them and make a composition, and I find that when I do this, the individual flaws of the cactuses don't really stand out as much. And that pretty much wraps it up. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like, and if you want to learn how to paint a whole desert scene with cactuses in a really easy and fast way, I think you'll like to watch this video next.